Hi BookTube, and welcome to a new video. This is a sort of thematic discussion video which will sort of throw in elements of talking about specific books, because in recent years there seems to be a sort of growing trend within fiction of books that are sort of faux memoir or trying to unpick the seams of biography. It's sort of fiction striking back at non-fiction's claims to be non-fiction, I think. I don't mean sort of books about, you know, nature or whatever. I'm talking about specifically biography, memoir and autobiography. And I think fiction is trying to make the case that, no, these are no more or no more non-fictional than our works of fiction. And it was prompted by this book, Tell, by Jonathan Buckley, which has been shortlisted for the Goldsmiths Prize. Now, the Goldsmiths Prize is for innovative fiction, but in the last few years I've read Hernan Diaz's Trust, Catherine Lacey's The Biography of X, Eliza Clark's Penance, Annie Ernaux's The Years, and I'm sure there are loads of others that sort of tackle this sort of form of memoir and biography and autobiography. So it's not innovative in sort of trying to subvert the nature of these works of non-fiction. That in itself is not innovative. I think to be genuinely innovative, you have to tick at least one of three boxes. One is innovative language, one is innovative form, and the third is innovative ideas that you're dealing with in the book. So not strictly the form necessarily, though the form may support it, but sort of interesting ideas. And just to return to Annie Ernaux before I sort of launch into this. So this book, The Years, one of my favourite books of all time, is a biography of Annie Ernaux, but it's really a biography of France, because it's positing the life of Annie Ernaux up to the point at which this book was published is entirely refracted and, if not determined, by what's going on in France, in society and culture, sort of almost like sort of superimposed on Annie Ernaux's life. This is much more the biography of France than the biography of Annie Ernaux. Now, if it's the history of France, that period, that is non-fiction, that's history, right? But it's done artfully, it's done as a conceit that Annie Ernaux, the character, is refracted through the history of France. So that artifice, that conceit, begins to steer it away from just being straight non-fiction, in the same way as David Markson's books, later books, use quotes and factlets about real-life historical figures to entirely create a work of fiction. Now, Annie Ernaux herself was the Nobel laureate, I think 2 years ago, and one of the labels applied to her that she writes autofiction, and she comes down on this like a ton of bricks. She says, yes, every incident that appear in my books happened to me. They are true. However, the moment I set them down on paper and start to arrange them into a narrative, that renders it fiction. Because even if the chronology of the events that happened in her life is correctly reproduced on the page, the time scale at which those events take place are necessarily compressed, because these books are, 100 to 200 pages long. And any one incident, it might be over in a second. Like if a writer is describing a slap, violence is very quick, very fleeting. And yet a literary treatment of that might take a whole paragraph, which would, to read even inside your head rather than loud, would take longer than the time of a slap. Equally, if you were writing about someone who was perched on the roof of their house because of the area they lived in was flooded, and they might be up there for hours until they're rescued, you're not going to write within your book the equivalent time scale. The time it takes them to be rescued, let's say for sake of argument, 6 hours. You're not going to write 6 hours worth of material. Time doesn't work like that in literature, particularly in fiction. And one of the things about biographies and memoir is that they're always historical. Because if you're going to encapsulate a life, a whole life, or most of a life, and in fact they never do, because if it's an autobiography, because the death part can never be written by them. But anyway, if you're going to encapsulate a whole life within the pages of a book, you're relying on sort of anecdotes and relaying incidents and events from that life. So it's in the past. And one of the interesting things that Jonathan Buckley's told that it does is it's trying to sort of do that, but put a spin of that this is happening in the now, not the events of the character that he's talking about. But the structure of this book is the subject of the biography and the film. It's two different artists at work on the subject's life. But the filmmaker is interviewing one of this guy's members of staff on his vast estate in Scotland. And they're taping the 5 interviews with this person. And that periodically in the text it says pause as the interviewee actually, stops for a breath. But it also says inaudible, where clearly they're playing the tape back and they can't quite hear what's being said. And they also say indecipherable. Again, they can hear what's being played on the tape, but they can't make it out. Now, I'd actually argue that inaudible and indecipherable are tautologous, because while something may be indecipherable because you can't quite make out the words, you're still hearing them speak. You know they're speaking, you just can't tell what the words are, which to me is the same as inaudible, because you still know they're speaking because you can hear that there's something on the tape, you just can't make out the words. So I don't think that distinction works. But what the author's trying to do by that is say, look, this is real-time conversation of these interviews with this woman, but they're not, because this is from a tape being played back, which is why we have pause, indecipherable, inaudible. So already what is being pitched as in the here and now is shunted into the past because it's being replayed on tape. So that distinction doesn't work. So biographies, or artful treatments of biographies as fiction, they all force the subject matter into the past, which means you get flashbacks or anecdotes, which makes it quite hard to be innovative. Having said that, there are plenty of these books that do try and do something with form. None of them are doing anything with language, except possibly this one, Hernan Diaz's Trust, although what he's doing with language is very much tied in with the form. So to give you an idea of what this book is about, it's about a millionaire Wall Street financier, and there's 4 treatments of his life. The first is like a pulp novel that's seeking to sort of assassinate his reputation. But because it's a pulp novel, the language is pretty uninvolving. It's not great literary language. It's pulp. The second is a hagiography to redress the balance. And again, as a hagiography, the language isn't great. It's at the same level as the pulp, although in a different way. It's only those are 2 bold stratagems by Diaz, because he could easily lose the reader going, this isn't a great read. This is pulp. This is hagiography, clearly. But it's only when you get to the third, which is the financier has commissioned a young woman to actually write his biography. And she's telling her story of how she got the gig, the challenges she faced. So it's as much about her as it is about him, because we've already seen the hagiography. And then the fourth, which absolutely makes this book for me, is the journal of the wife of the financier. So she has been written out, or not written out, but she's been kept out of the other 3 narratives on the word of the financier. He doesn't want his wife exposed within the book, so he doesn't expose her in his own hagiography, and he keeps giving sort of instructions to the Italian writer, don't bring her into it, don't bring her into it. And finally we hear her voice of the wife, because she's in a sanatorium dying of cancer. I think it's cancer, it might be consumption, but anyway. And the writing in there, the language in there is absolutely extraordinary. So the structure of this is, we're offered up the biography of this financier through two very partisan eyes, those of an enemy and those of the man himself, trying to whitewash his whole reputation. And then we get actually the person who's missing from this biography, whose story in a way is much more compelling, which is the wife. So this, in both structure and language, is, I think, genuinely innovative. So again, just to sort of return to this notion of biography through retelling. Now, it's called Tell after all, you know. So the interesting thing about this book is it's a unity of voice. Just this gardener who works on the estate, she is retelling everything, but of course she only has a partial view of this guy's life because she was a gardener. She didn't have that much interaction with him. He wasn't into his garden, unlike his wife. So she had much more interaction with the wife. So we get her recollections about the wife. We get lots of gossip and stories from her fellow staff members within the estate, who interact with the subject much more and in different ways. We get members of the family who come to visit the estate, and again, sometimes she interacts with some of them and not others, those who are drawn to the garden, those who are drawn to the view. So actually, although there's a unity of voice, a great chunk of what she's relaying is hearsay. And the point I think that Jonathan Buckley's making about this book is that it's impossible to know a person fully. It's impossible to nail down a single version of a person because, after all, each of us displays different sides of ourselves to different people, the interactions we have with them, what's demanded of us. If we like them, we show them one mask. If we don't like them, we hide behind another mask. Now, the problem I have with this is hardly revolutionary revelations. This is pretty basic stuff, and in a way they all do this. So a biography of X is ostensibly about an artist who refused to sort of reveal her private self, even though she was constantly projecting this sort of performative self. And in the same way, its point is, well, you can never really know her. Even her lover, long-time lover, who's the main supplier of information, of biographical detail on her, even she has to admit in places she doesn't really know her. What makes this book interesting is a sort of alternative history background that her life is set against, whereas one where the southern states of America have seceded again into a sort of religious, moral majority type of state. But to me, that the interest of the book is in that alternative history, not the biographical elements. Here we have Eliza Clark's Penance. So this is a sort of true crime story that's looking to dig beneath the biographical details of the crime into the three perpetrators of the crime in order to work out why they did it. Motive, a very absolutely fundamental thing in true crime. But Clark's point is that true crime, the sort of the taste for it, the fact that it's sort of ballooned into sort of cultural consciousness and it's so popular, is really quite offensive, which is a thesis I agree with, I have to say. But in doing so, she never gets behind the characters and the motivations of these criminals, and ends up lecturing the reader. She has an interview between a Guardian journalist, and the Guardian is the liberal left newspaper in the UK. Sort of the moral conscience. I would like to think it's the moral conscience of the liberal society. And she's interviewing the disgraced author who was prosecuted for phone hacking, where journalists in the 80s and 90s literally hacked the phones of celebrities, including the royal family, in order to, get gossip and dish the dirt on them. It was a huge scandal in the UK and actually led to the closure of some newspapers. So he's rebuilding his career by sort of plugging into the world of true crime and its popularity, and has written a book called Penance, which presumably is this one that we're reading. And this Guardian journalist is lecturing this guy on the morality, not only of obviously the phone hacking, but also what he's done here in sort of being a vampire on these sort of tragic events. And that raises the issue of the author's position, the author's intent within biography. You know, it seems to me there's a spectrum. On the one hand, you get sort of complete neutrality where the author doesn't intrude. They just dig out the biographical facts and limit themselves in the interpretations, in the psychoanalytical motivations of their characters, all the way through to a book like this, where the biography is not about the subject, it's about the author. It's their reasons for doing it. And which brings me to a non-fiction biography. This is called A Thread of Violence by Mark O'Connell, and deals with an infamous case of double murder in Ireland, where the guy was finally captured and sentenced to 30 years. And on his release, Mark O'Connell sees him in the street and recognises him and decides that he wants to try and approach him, and gradually the idea of writing, for want of a better word, a biography on him. Now, this murderer was a member of the privileged classes, never had to work a day in his life, but eventually his sort of inherited money was running low. And he comes back to Ireland, to Dublin, from Spain, where he'd been living with his wife and child, because he's going to do a bank robbery. He knows he's got the cover of the IRA, who were carrying out bank robberies to finance their arms. So he thinks that under the cover of that, he can carry out a bank robbery. And he knows that he needs a gun and a car. So he goes to steal both, and in doing so, murders the owner of the car and the owner of the gun. And his only sort of rationale that he keeps giving out is, I needed the money, I formed this plan, the plan went badly wrong, I ended up murdering 2 people. And he never got to the bank. He never got to the point of holding up a bank. O'Connell says, no, there's got to be more to it than that. We had the biographical detail of the events of his life, of the events of the bank, of the murders, but we need to get to the bottom of what lies behind it. Because if you think about it, you know, he readily resorts to violence in killing these 2 people when they seem to be getting in the way of his plan. And the guy he shot for the shotgun wasn't getting in his way at all. He just wanted 150 euros, which is not a huge amount of money, for the gun. And O'Connell, and the guy thought, oh, I'm not paying that, and shot him with his own gun. So there's a propensity to violence. The guy is a sociopath, clearly, if not a psychopath. And O'Connell wants to explore that, which is not unreasonable. But he himself admits he never peels away the layers of this guy. This guy's from the privileged classes. He's an aristocrat. O'Connell cannot share a language and a value system and even a communication system whereby he can penetrate this guy. You know, this guy's from almost like another world, and not just because he's a sociopath, just within his class and upbringing. So that's the first thing. And that's borne out by the fact that when this guy was caught, he was in the flat of the finance minister of the government, because of course in the social circles he moved in, he would know these people. They all moved in the same circles, and that caused such a scandal in Ireland. Of course, the finance minister had to resign, even though he knew nothing about the fact that this guy, his friend, had just murdered 2 people. It was just synchronicity. The guy was in his flat. He'd lent him his flat, and it nearly brought the government down. That's why the case was so infamous in Ireland. And every time the guy was up for parole, he was knocked back because people would say, oh, it's just the government protecting their own kind of thing. Even though 30 years later that was no longer relevant because it's a totally different government. Anyway, but an interesting point is made to O'Connell by one of his friends, who says, 2 people died here. You're not just presenting merely the biographical detail, which is well known and been done to death in the previous 30 years. You're trying to winkle out the motives and thought processes of this guy. You're making him into a character, i.e., you're making it fictional. These are your speculations. These are your layperson's psychoanalytic interpretations. And again, you get this blend. So even though these types of books are trying to sort of make that point, it's actually the one work of avowedly non-fiction that really opens up the notion that, and it's there on the page, that this is no less fictional than avowedly fictional books. And again, interestingly, the character, sorry, I shouldn't call him the character, the person who committed the murders was the basis of character in John Banville's works of fiction, in some of Banville's crime fiction. So it's very much, as I say, this fictionalising, this making of a character. Once you delve beneath the biographical detail into the thoughts and logic of a person, you're making them into a fictional character. Because those types of things, yes, they're sort of pseudo-scientific psychoanalysis and psychiatry and all these sorts of medical diagnoses of mental states, which, let's face it, are pretty poorly defined even in the sort of 21st century. There's very little that we know about the human mind, the human brain, particularly sort of emotions and memories and trauma and all this sorts of stuff. And this explicitly makes the point that he's rendered his subject a character. So the final thing I want to say about this, again, blending the a work of non-fiction that actually veers over into fiction and makes the point of all these fictional treatments for them, is that why is this so important to McConnell? He recognises the guy on the street, but up to that point, I don't get the sense that O'Connell was going to write a book about this guy. It's only because he saw him on the street and it sort of jolted his memory of. The reason it's personal to him, and he never analyses this in the book, and I think it's a huge failing, is that, as I say, the flat in which the guy was courting happened to be in the same block of luxury flats as O'Connell's grandparents lived. So he sees that there's a connection between this guy and the crime and himself, Mark O'Connell. There isn't. There's a happenstance of spatial coexistence or coeval. They lived in the same, well, they didn't live. This guy was found in the same block as his grandparents lived. And O'Connell never, ever analyses that as to, that's why he's written this book. That's the connection. That's the link. That's why this weighs as cultural capital in his mind, that he then goes on to want to pursue. Because why do biographers write biographies? If you're talking memoir and autobiography, it's pretty obvious that the subject wants to talk about their selves, their lives, maybe for self-help, maybe for instruction, maybe it's just an ego exercise. But for a biographer, why does a biographer choose to write about Shakespeare or about Debbie Harry? Because they have some import, some cultural significance within their minds. They meant something to them, unless they've just been commissioned. So, so we want a book about Shakespeare. You, as a great biographer, would you entertain doing such a project? But normally it's, and again this returns to what I was saying about the spectrum of being entirely neutral and not really putting yourself into the biography at all, versus the other end of the spectrum where actually it's not about the subject matter, it's about you, the biographer. And this is where we come back to this, because ultimately this is just, for all it's sort of trying to mess around with time, this is the story of its subject matter, of a self-made billionaire living on this estate who, at the start of the book, has disappeared and is presumed dead. And ultimately that's all it is. It's his life story. So the first thing to say is, I'm not very interested in self-made billionaires. I don't really want to read about them. I want to read about more people more relevant to me, I suppose. The story of a biography, even a faux biography, is the subject, but you want to go deeper than that. You want deeper than the person. And what I mean by that is, you want something happening on a textual level, not a story level, but on the textual level. And for that, I would go back to trust. Because what's going on here are notions of the missing voice of the wife, the fact that through 4 texts, you finally get a version of this missing wife. You get all these different types of text. You know, there isn't a, you know, here there's a unity of voice, even though it's fragmented to sort of hearsay and gossip and all that sort of stuff. Here there are four voices. So in the end, it's not a story about the multi-millionaire financier. We're not really interested in him. We're not interested in his biography. We're interested in the text, the structure of the four different ways of which his, you know, the biographical subject is just a scaffold pole. This is about exclusion. This is about, being partial in your reading about people, as is this, as is, you know, all of these sort of saying, oh, well, we can't really get to the grips of someone, as is even in non-fiction an admittance that he couldn't pin him down. He couldn't get beyond the guy's sort of, I needed the money, I was going to rob a bank kind of thing. And finally, this is the book that sort of straddles both fiction and non-fiction. It's called Ha, as in ha ha, but actually it's also the initials HA of Über Aqua, who is the subject matter of this massive book. It's an 850-page book, or thereabouts, that again comes down on the side of saying it's impossible to pin somebody down, to really fully know a person. But it's clearly laid out here as to why that is, in a way much more convincing than it was tried here. Because Aqua was a man who was obsessed with suicide, taking his own life, and ultimately achieved it. And because he knew that he had this sort of dark sort of, you know, thoughts in him, whenever he met somebody new, he weighed up pretty quickly whether they could handle darkness, whether they themselves may have contained darkness, or whether they couldn't. And he showed two different sides of himself, according to whether it's someone that he could share the darkness with, or whether it's someone he had to protect from his dark side. And there are your masks straight away, your two fundamental masks to this character, Über Aqua. These are further refracted and fragmented by the mask he had to wear socially in professional dealings. So, his personality as a radical proponent of Quebec independence, for which he was jailed for being found with a gun. His dealings with publishers, his dealings with academics, because he had to, writing wasn't making enough money. He had to sort of get jobs teaching in academia. His wife, who was in on the pact, she had stopped him committing suicide the first time round, and after that they formed a pact whereby she wouldn't stop him again the second time round. She would let him go. So she was in on it. She knew about it. His relationship with all his erotic relationships with lovers, that he was unfaithful to his wife. His relationships between English Canadians and French Canadians, given his penchant for Quebec independence. His relationships with professional medics, psychologists and actual doctors. So each of these people that he interacted with are giving their opinions on what kind of guy Über Aqua was. And they're massively, they diverge one from another massively, as you'd expect. And that is brilliantly done in here. This takes 850 pages to say, look, the wife gets a lot of page time in this, and even she, together with his best friend who wrote this, who's called Gordon Sheppard, between the two of them, over 30 years I think they took to write this book, they couldn't nail him down, but they explain why. They did nail him down in the sense of they unpeeled each of his layers and spread them out so you could see them individually, but what they couldn't do was bring them all back together in a sense of the unified man. Now, interestingly, that makes all this sound like non-fiction, like a genuine biography, and perhaps it is. But there's artifice employed within this book that, to me, makes it fiction. Although I think if you'd read it, you could come down either side of the coin, to be honest. One of those artifices is, in this envelope, it's a reproduction of Aqua's suicide note. And that's on page something like 698. So a long way into the book. Now, Sheppard took a decision that that's where this letter would go. Not on page 1, not within the first 3 chapters, but then, even though we've talked loads about, you know, what motivated Aquan, why he had these dark thoughts, his failed attempts, all this sort of stuff. So we've had all of that earlier in the book. He could have lodged it in there, but he didn't. So that is, like I was saying with, you know, Ernaux, that is an artful arrangement of the material. So it's a biographical detail, but it's where it is placed within the book, because it, like you know, most of these books, it's not chronologically in order of events, because you're basically giving microphone time to each of the people you're interviewing it. So you're sort of doing it by people commenting, not the chronology of events. So even a book like this, A, admits that there's no unified person, and B, is using artifice of how narrative is formed and shaped to veer it over from being non-fiction to fiction. Now, I don't think Sheppard has a problem if this is called fiction or non-fiction. Well, that's the difference to, say, McConnell's book, and the rest of these are avowedly fiction. Now, I will just say, you know, I brought this up because if all you're going to say is, oh, it's really hard to pin down a character, duh, it's really hard to know someone in all their facets. Yeah, sure. And the O'Connell thing, I think, is interesting because it explicitly, and this has come from outside O'Connell, this is a friend of his, as I say, commenting back to him, you are fictionalising a real-life character who murdered 2 people. You are making a character of him in the same way as Raskolnikov in Dostoevsky, in the same way as John Banville in his crime books, dealing with the same character, interestingly. Because you are adding, you are providing stuff beyond mere biographical fact, biographical detail that we know is in the public domain. So I'm not sure the value of this trend for faux memoir, for unpicking the streams of biography, to basically proclaim all non-fiction in this sphere of memoir, autofiction, biography, is fictional. I agree with it, which is why I think the concept of autofiction is also a tautology, because I believe any author of fiction can only resort to stuff that's inside their heads. Now, whether they've lived that and experienced that themselves directly, or whether it's been stuff they've read, they've seen on the news, an anecdote told to them by someone else, it becomes part of their experience because they've remembered it. It was significant enough for them to remember. Therefore, auto and fiction is, well, it's actually not just a tautology, it's also an oxymoron. So it's a term I reject just as much as Ernaux rejects it. Having said all of this, and obviously I've been quite sort of, even though, you know, I've loved Trust. I mean, Trust is one of my favourite books. If we decide that Hat is fiction, I love that, absolutely love that. I love Annie Ernaux's The Years. So, although books have come out of this trend that I have enjoyed and really relish, I am sort of I think it's a bit of a tired trope. I wonder if it's even a necessary trope, but that's a different thing. But having said that, one of my finished manuscripts that I'm trying to find a home for is a ghostwriter writing, you know, playing back on tape her recordings of her subject. Now, a ghostwriter is different to a biographer because, as I said, biographers, mainly, they choose someone culturally significant to them that would engage their passion and their interest enough to stick with seeing through a project of, you know, loads of research and then writing up and all that sort of stuff. A ghostwriter is different. A ghostwriter is a gun for hire. They do it because they're going to get paid for the gig. They, you know, the person that they're ghostwriting about probably has no cultural significance in their minds before they meet them and start the process. But my emphasis, as I've been saying, is not on, oh, it's so hard to pin down a character. I've actually provided a character who doesn't vary at all, who has no side, no mask, because he's a gangster. You know, what you see is what you get, which is naked threat and brutality and all this sort of stuff. But my interest is in her. I'm not interested in him. He's just scaffold, as I've also been saying. The interest is what she is doing. She's not simply relaying his story. It's what's happening at a textual level, because she's writing two books. She's transcribing what she's been given on the tape, which is what she's being paid for. But she's got a parallel text where she's making comments because she's so appalled by this guy's morality as a gangster, as a man of violence. And that's the text that's sort of both reflectively commenting on the other text, but becomes a text in itself about her. She is the subject of my book, not the gangster. You know, what is a ghostwriter? What relationship do they have? They have no ownership because their name will never appear on the spine. Therefore, how much can she get away with behind the anonymity? Because the book will come out in his name. What can she get away with? Not in his text, because it will, you know, he will not wear any veering away from what he wants to say. But what can she get away with in her text, and can she ever expose it to the public without provoking a violent reaction from him? So for me, it's all happening at a textual level. I don't want to say too much more about it. There are more stuff going on at a textual level. I don't want to say too much stuff about it because it hasn't found a home yet. But anyway, so even though I'm not particularly beholden to this trend, as I say, of faux memoir, autofiction, unpicking the seams of biography, I've indulged and explored it myself. But I think and I hope I'm taking it in a new direction, and a genuinely innovative one, unlike the book that's actually just got nominated for a prize for innovative fiction, which is Tell. And I just finally, interestingly, I said about the McConnell that there was a class divide between O'Connell and this criminal. There is in here as well, because you know, we're mainly getting the narrative from the staff, from the servants, who are of a lesser class than their subject matter, the person they're talking about, their boss. And interestingly, or in fact the opposite of interestingly, when she's relaying her story, sometimes she's alluding to things, she's trying to make comparisons or references to people or events or trends, like we all do. I mean, we all indulge in it. Something she saw on TV or something she read in a newspaper. And sometimes she can't quite remember the name of the person or where she first came across it. But, you know, whether she can remember the name or not, her observations are banal. And this, unfortunately, makes the narrative rather banal, even though when the hearsay and the gossip drops in, it does sort of lift the energy a bit. But when she herself comments on it or provides context as she thinks she's doing by comparing it with something external, her comparisons are so banal that it fails to raise this book above the banal. And as I say, ultimately, it's just the story of this self-made billionaire, which I was completely uninterested in. It tried to sort of break that up and subvert it and fragment it with, as I say, how it played with time, but ultimately failed. Anyway, so I hope you find that subject interesting. I don't know if we're going to get more books of these series. I ought to mention the author Lance Olson, who has written books on Bowie, on Kafka, on Nietzsche, on interwar Weimar Germany, the culture there, which are all sort of fictional biographies. He's an author I really like, and but again, I think he's fully aware that the subject matters, be it Bowie, Nietzsche, Kafka, are scaffolding. They are not the focus. They are not the hub of the book. They are the scaffolding for him to hang what he wants to say, the ideas he wants to get across. I would throw Lance Olson. I should have bought his books out and thrown them in with the rest of these, because I really like Lance Olson. Anyway, I'm just rambling now. So, as I say, I hope you found that interesting. Till next time, thanks very much.